Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual AERI 2022 panel titled Dislocation, Exploring the Movement of Information, Records, and People. My name is 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞. I am one of 3 presenters, and I am here to get us started. I appreciate you all being here, and hopefully we'll be able to share a couple of really interesting insights on some research that we've been doing at the University of Washington. So my name is 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞. I will be entering my 3rd year of my PhD program at the University of Washington Information School. My 2 home-based fields are information studies and feminist studies, and I generally study records creators and record subjects, but specifically youth records creators and subjects, and that includes children and adolescents, with a proposed dissertation area in how natural disasters impact these youth who are needing their own records as well as creating records throughout their childhood and adolescence. So today I'll be sharing a little of very preliminary work. My dissertation proposal hasn't yet come up. I haven't taken my exams yet. And so I'm just sort of fidgeting with some questions, trying to figure out, what directions to take. So I'm very interested in having this conversation today with my colleagues. And so I'll begin with a short little introduction to the impact of natural disasters on children's lives. And I'll begin with a case study that's very close to home. So I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I was displaced in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit. And so my dissertation is also looking at both a personal aspect of my life as well as an area, a geographical area that's very familiar to me, as well as before and after disaster. So shortly after Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf coast of the United States in 2005, news reported that New Orleans lost about 25% of its 2,000 registered foster children. This lost status, and I put it like in quotes, because these children weren't necessarily lost, they were just not able to be located shortly after the storm hit. The lost status of these children and adolescents was a result of displaced caseworkers, unable to work, outdated case monitoring systems, and overall inadequate record-keeping practices. After about 2 months after Katrina hit in August of 2005, a majority of these lost children were located and reunited with either their biological families, caseworkers, or somewhere in between those system placements. So what began as a devastating natural disaster led to a life-changing human-made disaster for these displaced disaster youth survivors. 1 year later, in 2006, the Child and Family Services Improvement Act of 2006 became federal law as the public and politicians noted the extreme inefficiency of existing record-keeping systems and practices. This law in particular mandated that all states maintain written disaster plans for children in the foster care system. Prior to 2005, only about half of the states in the United States had policies or guidelines on addressing the management of children in institutional care during and after major disasters such as hurricanes, fires, tornadoes, droughts, or mass displacement as a result of these disasters. So prior to the law, government agencies did not or could not coordinate information sharing amongst themselves or with others, including their employees, or even they couldn't share information with biological or foster families. So with the passage of the law, youth in the foster care could not only could continue to receive care if displaced, but they could also ensure that their vital records would be accessible and preserved for the immediate and future use. So as a case study, the experiences of New Orleans foster care youth functions as a perfect example of when natural disasters and human-made disasters fail to address the information and memory needs of children and adolescents. This failure also points to the responsibilities caretakers or caregivers, whether that be the state or some sort of appointed individual like a caseworker or a foster family member, how these caregivers and caretakers have responsibilities that are entrusted on them once they take responsibilities for the care of these youth. Whether it is temporary while a child awaits reunification or long-term, such as during moments of mass trauma, such as war, human trafficking, genocide, medical negligence, invasion, forced migration, or natural disasters. So now I'll transition to just an overall discussion on children's records. So here is the other side of my research, right? I look at natural disasters in the context of how it impacts youth, but I'm also very much interested more generally in what children's records are, how they're created, how they're managed or not managed, and then also how children are represented in historic as well as contemporary records. The field of archival studies, unfortunately, has yet to fully explore those topics such as creation or use, or even just the impact of records created by and about children and adolescents. So in the case of institutional care, notable records might include physical documentation of experiences, including traumatic ones such as abuse, neglect, or violence, captured formally through court proceedings, mental or physical health screenings, social worker intake forms, or medical records. Electronic records nowadays in particular also would document crucial aspects of the care itself while the youth are in the foster care, from caseworker files to even the mementos created while placed in, like, say, a foster family situation, or records that were created prior to the youth going into the system and those created by biological families. So for these youth, extensive management of their lives oftentimes obstructs even their basic needs as well, such as needing birth certificates for school enrollment, for jobs, or like verifying their identities, or even just for personal growth. So in the context of disasters and displacement, records can also represent opportunities or obstacles to start a new life. There is extensive work needing to be done to further examine the needs of children's records from the child's perspective as well. So not only thinking about records created by institution for an institution, but how those records impact youth as people. And so we look at a lot of children's records today as being those created by adults, oftentimes for adults, or for the adult version of the child. But I would also argue that there's a need to think about that from the child's perspective while they are still a child or an adolescent. So in addition to diversifying an archival view of children's records, there's also a need to situate these records within the same systems that create and provide access and preservation. So I hope to not only build upon these questions of, like, well, what are children's records, but I am interested in, say, expanding on the research done by our colleagues in Australia on, like, how systems can better benefit care leavers. That's what foster children are often come to in Australia, through, like, a people-centered or an ethics-centered system as well as practices. For my own research, I aim to define what that people-centered or ethics-centered record keeping, record creating, and access would mean for young people in the United States, because that's not something that has yet been studied more broadly. And I also seek to ask, how can these systems and practices facilitate lifelong development, accountability, and memory retrieval needs of children and adolescents, especially those already experiencing instability as a result of, say, disasters. For the archival field, as well as for many individuals and communities, records document, symbolize, and bear witness to positive and negative experiences of institutional care held by children and adolescents. But children and adolescents experiencing trauma, such as witnessing, participating in, or receiving abuse, violence, neglect, abandonment, or forced displacement, may not receive or make use of records and the important information documented there. In particular, for youth trying to make sense of themselves, their past, and potentially their future through cognitive functions such as episodic memories, records serve as both evidence and contradictions to conscious and subconscious recollections. So as part of my doctoral studies, I seek to investigate how personal, institutional, active, or archival records aid in the development or future improvement of memories and memory creating and recalling functions in youth, as well as youth that might be in a particular situation, such as institutional care. So I'm going to wrap up really quickly. My last slide is still very much preliminary because in thinking about what these people-centered and ethics-centered systems could look like, I've been thinking about different models or different approaches that already exist as far as preserving and perhaps accessing children's records. And one really interesting model that I would like to continue to explore more is the life story work approach. So this is an intervention approach developed in the field of social work, where children themselves, as well as sometimes with the support or through an adult such as a caseworker or a foster family, use record creating as a way to recognize their past, also to document their current or present, and then hopefully be able to use some of that documentation for the future. So social life story work has not yet been applied very often in the US. I think it's applied more so in the UK. But thinking about, you know, how can a formal system that is already embedded in social work where foster care is most closely aligned with, how can we think about, as archival practitioners or memory workers, how can we think about how children can be encouraged to think of their records as not only documenting the behind the scenes of their care, but also documenting the ways in which that they might be able to continue to navigate the world and potentially look back in their past in a better way. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sarah, who's going to continue our conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞. I am blown away by your research. I'm so excited to have heard that in that form. So many thoughts. I don't know how I can follow up. So hi, everyone. My name is Sarah 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞. I, too, am a third-year PhD student at University of Washington at Information School. I'm going to share a little bit about my project that also potentially will become a dissertation project around refugees and immigrants and deep memory and information disorder in their trajectory. So I am pronouns she, they. And my research is based around socio-technical information systems such as social media platforms, information disorder, which includes mis and disinformation, memory, particularly between intergenerational memory, and in this case, trust and around the Vietnamese diaspora from mid-20th century to present day. Those dates are due to because basically it's happened during the war between America and Vietnam in 1964-65, and then to today as more generations of Vietnamese people come to the US. So first, I am thinking about this concept of deep memory, which I learned about recently, about how a survivor's trauma and reasoning to a crisis as deep memory, and their survivor's memory that differentiates from historians' narrative. Mostly thinking about how, personally for me, growing up taking history classes, there was a specific narrative around the Vietnam War that never resonated with me. So I never really resonated with like US history in general. And then also what I had learned from, say, my family members. So what I was thinking about, like, how does the trauma from my family to what I learned from, say, hierarchical media or from higher education, how does that affect my understanding of the world and how I view and perceive the world, which leads into the information disorder. So I think that this is an approach to understand like how cultural memory is then formed and then affects how people actually act within real life. And then I'm intersecting that concept with, which I said earlier, information disorder, which encapsulates problematic information as a general term around something that can be inaccurate or misleading or inappropriately attributed. Misinformation, which is all of mis and disinformation, talking about intent behind it. And then malinformation, which is the intent also of causing harm, and then propaganda, which can have more of like a top-down hierarchical effect of political communication. So a lot of that does have to do with facticity and intent. So thinking about how historians are very based within facticity, and then also how our memory, how much facticity or intent is actually shaping and forming how we then want to see the world or have changed the way that we see the world. And then also just thinking separate from just historians, but then also media. What is their intentions within their facticity? What are their sources? And what do they want to get across to the public at that moment in time? So within my research recently, I've been looking at the US presidential election, the 2020 presidential election, which also happened during the early times of the COVID pandemic. And during that time, a lot of I guess the terminology of like fake news and mis and disinformation started spreading a lot within the Vietnamese diaspora within YouTube. As you'll see here, there's a lot of Vietnamese media producers who create their own news shows. And a lot of those ended up getting flagged on Reddit channels, on Facebook, and within the community of saying that they were either very true and they created a cult following, or they were actually very false. And so it had this polarization effect, which we actually see across a lot of different communities and cultures. In particular, though, there are within the Vietnamese groups, I'm looking at what are the cultural and social and historical contexts that affect the ways that why people see what they do, which I'll get into later on. And then another form of the motives behind this project was that there were a lot of also social justice movements and activist movements in the Vietnamese community around politics, which isn't usually regular in the Vietnamese diaspora because there has been usually a acculturation and a sort of avoidance of political action in the community. A lot of it can be attributed to assimilation, acculturation, or just being able to survive within this new host country. So within that, there was this group called Viet Fact Check that started doing fact checking and content moderation as a volunteer effort of a lot of media that's happening on, that's being published online as well as Facebook. So this was very popular. This type of practice was also very popular in Spanish speaking communities, but there was very little, any sort of attention paid to Vietnamese communities. So that's where I wanted to start with. So this is all research that I've been working on this past year, working on it within either looking at Facebook data and then also doing focus group interviews. And so this is just kind of a crazy Venn diagram that I created late night once, trying to understand what are the media outlets that different generations of Vietnamese Americans, well, actually, this also included the larger diaspora because this included like people in Canada, Germany, and France who decided to join the focus group. And they were talking about just the different types of news sources that they would read and then decide, or read or hear about and decide if it was trustworthy, untrustworthy, or if it was mixed or undecided. And this kind of told me of whether or not they believed what matched up with their personal memories of their lived experiences. So wave 1 and 2 participants are actually the early immigrants to that left Vietnam. So that can be refugees who left immediately after the war in 1975, or second wave refugees which actually left around the early 80s. All of those were considered asylum into the new host countries. So they actually believed in some sort of safety net that they received from their host countries. Wave 3 and 4 on the right-hand side would be considered immigrants. They were not considered refugees, so they didn't receive the same type of social services or support from their host country. So, and then there's the wave 4, which is actually people who are immigrating over now, who come from a very different social class post-war, not running from a country that is actually still trying to recover from the war. So they're coming from very different social contexts. And so then we've noticed that there's a very different understanding of which media they tend to read and then also tend to judge towards. And then you can see that this younger generation uses a lot more like social media, sometimes newspapers, very particular about the types of people who they actually follow and read from. And then on the left-hand side, a lot more people who are still very fluent in Vietnamese and also have very Vietnamese language, and then also have a very different understanding and then just ideology of how they see, say, the presidential election. These people also have firsthand experience corruption in their elections during the 1975 presidential election after the war. So they have a lot more judgment and kind of discernment towards what type of media they do and trust than the third and fourth. So we'll go to the next slide. Another early finding that me and some of my co-researchers have been looking at are what's actually happening on Facebook and what types of media have been actually pretty popular. So one of the more common ones is this anti-communist sentiment. as one of the main driver of misinformation. So Donald Trump Jr. and Donald Trump during the presidency were very keen on communicating this type of anti-Chinese, anti-communist rhetoric, which really picked up in the Vietnamese community because of what happened during the war of the separation between capitalism and then communism. So that this type of like video, or say in others, actually I didn't include in this slide, but there's this video or types of like memes were really widespread. One of the things that we did find was that Facebook actually flagged a lot of this misinformation if it was in English. So if this was shared on an English Facebook group, that was flagged and taken down. Months later, when we grabbed this data and it was in a Vietnamese Facebook group, it was not taken down. So you can see that there's this disparity between content moderation on Facebook, allowing this narrative to prolong within the Vietnamese community. And then other types of early findings that we found within the focus groups, as well as within the Facebook data, are intergenerational divides. Just like you saw earlier in the Venn diagram, there's a disconnection between generations of Vietnamese people around politics, current events, and historical events. There's also a lot of evidence of remnants of Cold War politics, terminology around like socialist, communism, relationships with China. A lot of those would be a division factor between whether someone was telling the truth or following a true story or not. Historical trauma. So a lot of misinformation pulls on this patriotism narrative or fear of socialism or being a good immigrant. So like I was saying earlier, between these different waves of generation of Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese diaspora, there is this, is it because you want to be a good immigrant that you believe in a certain narrative, or are you kind of continue a certain memory in this context? So other ones, I feel like I'm going over time, so I'm going to kind of just go through this swiftly because I was not keeping my time. Our power dimensions, which is mostly just thinking about these geopolitical powers between state-run disinformation campaigns, which was very heavily used during the Vietnam War. So it continued through, there's a lot more belief that it is continuing through, and which we do see very prevalent today. Language barriers, not only is it that a lot of news media is only in English and not being translated in Vietnamese, but then also between the generations of Vietnamese, there's actually very different contexts of different words. So if someone is speaking in Vietnamese prior to 1975, is very different than they're speaking today because of what was allowed to be said during the communism eras. And then we have the political economy of technology, which is the critiques around Facebook and YouTube, and what Facebook and YouTube is allowing to stay up on the internet as this sort of quote unquote archive for the community to actually see and continue as a narrative to see that it is actually true or not, versus these being flagged and taken down within Facebook's AI content moderation practices. So in general, this project is still coming up and still being, it's important to me and in the community, because as you can see here, this actually happened in the Seattle, Washington area. But there are some of these Vietnamese community members living in Little Saigons who actually went to the January 6th insurrection, bringing their type of like trauma and sentiments and then memories to these political spaces and political spheres without thinking about the larger context, historical and cultural context of why might these information still exist in their storylines. So that is where my research is attempting to go, and I will pass this on to 𝐀𝐤𝐿.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you, or Sarah and Ita, my bad. But Sarah, your presentation is phenomenal. You know how much I am obsessed with your research. I love the way you're engaging with all these different histories and these different social and economic structures, and how people are understanding them in relationship to disinformation and misinformation of Vietnamese populations. I'm really excited to engage in discourse with both of y'all next. So, okay, hey everybody. My name is 𝐀𝐤𝐭𝐥𝐿. I use she, her pronouns. The other person that's on this presentation but isn't here is a student at the University of Minnesota, American Studies Department. Her name is Kristen Reynolds. She also uses she, her pronouns. I am a third-year PhD student in the Department of Information Science at the University of Washington, and I study information infrastructures. I study the history of technology as well as Black diasporic histories across the Americas. And I did that because I messed up my slide, child. And so the slide about my personal bioinformation, I don't know where it went, but I just had to foreground that real quick. So we're just going to jump directly into more of the project. The project that we titled it is Future Making from the Undercommons, Preserving Black Homelands. So the overall or central goal of this project is to develop an interactive digital archive that records the stories and experiences of Black people around the world, and how they are surviving climate crises and different disasters. This project originally came up at the end of last year and at the top of this year, when Kristen and I were having like a long conversation about the ways in which Black stories are actually left out of a lot of climatic disasters and climate stories more largely, and the stories that are similar to like Hurricane Katrina in the United States, or a few hurricanes in the Caribbean. Besides those, we don't really understand how natural disasters actually impact Black populations, especially with like enslaved Black history in the Americas. And so one of the central goals of our project is to figure out what are the narratives and what are the stories and what are the experiences that are happening, and how do we document them and record them for the sake of community, right? One of the things that Kristen and I oftentimes talk about, and as well, and is central to this project, is not having the academy necessarily control what the outcome of this research is, but rather actually allow community members from Black communities around the world to engage in conversations with one another about how they're surviving these climate crises and how they're moving towards more liberatory possibilities for themselves in terms of their future making process. And so the long-term goal of this particular project that we have is to develop a green data center that takes into account 4 central concepts of Black history, Afrofuturism, open data, and organic architecture. Our main goal for this was to develop a physical space where at some point in the future, folks can get and gather together, where they can discuss and have like community-based spaces to organize, to think, to create, to research, to design, to develop all these different type of strategies and techniques to intervene in climatic disasters and climate change more broadly from a community standpoint. We came up with these particular concepts because we were really interested in how things like the aesthetics of Afrofuturism paired also with different concepts, which we oftentimes talk about pairing with Afrofuturism, which is Afro-pessimist political realities, of fungibility and imperialism and genocide, etc. And how those different aesthetics might impact our understanding, and of course, Black history more directly. Black histories would impact open data and organic architecture as almost like this design method, or a type of not really a design method, but really a multi-technique, which I'll get into later on, which is the meta stories of origin, which we're using to actually engage in a lot of these conversations more directly. But yeah, so how those things are affecting the building of these particular data centers in an effort to decrease the data center's carbon footprint on the world. Okay, so next is topics. So the topics that we are directly engaging with in terms of researching what communities not only need, but also the different like scholarly research that we could find around community-centered effects of disasters, particularly. So the first one is socioeconomic and environmental drivers of migration. We understand that migration has a very social, is very specifically socially caused, right? And environmental migrations aren't necessarily natural, but are socially constructed themselves. If we understand environmental disasters themselves to be socially influenced. So one of the things that we oftentimes talk about in this project is the social formation and social construction of these disasters as not just a political conversation, but also as a historical conversation, mapping how climate change, how CO2 emissions, how the ozone layer, how different things around specifically climate change and more atmospheric sciences have focused primarily on the natural science part of it, but also how these histories are directly involved in impacted by histories of things like colonialism and imperialism and things like that. So we understand migration to be a smaller part of that very, very large power conversation. And so the second topic that we discuss is access to mobility, data, open science, and privacy concerns. This is particularly around how we plan on storing information, preserving information, disseminating information. We believe that information should be deleted and erased when needed, and it's not necessarily around trying to preserve or archive information for the sake of archiving or preserving information, but rather as a way to disseminate information amongst one another, to have a more community-centered conversation around how these disasters affect Black communities around the world, and learning from those communities, but also if things get too out of hand, or if politics come in, we oftentimes talk about the ways in which governments intervene, co-opt, develop, and design insurgent practices to dismantle a lot of movements and organizing amongst community. And so one of the things that we talk about often is trying to delete information, or not necessarily save information, but understanding information as something that is fleeting versus something that needs to be maintained or stored or kept. So yes, the third one that we talk about in detail is measuring the impact of natural disasters, conflict and climate change on migration, which is similar to the first one, but this one particularly has to do with how much are these things actually affecting Black communities globally. And that is a question of how communities have been experiencing these things across time. And so we oftentimes like to focus on the larger political histories that involve Black communities globally. The fourth is designing accessible digital platforms and information architecture. This is particularly for getting access to those informations. One of the conversations we have is around translation of information. So how do a person in the United States who mainly speaks English, for example, of the Black community, might communicate with someone from Brazil, or someone from Haiti, or someone from Mexico, or someone from, let's say, Nigeria or Kenya. And so we are trying to understand information across language boundaries and language borders, and trying to figure out how we can share information in a way that is globally connected and networked through these different things, and also leaving information where information needs to be left as well. But the fifth and the final one is information migration, information stillness, and transgenerational information dispersion of different Black communities around the world. This particular one is complicated, and I'll get into this one later. I'm gonna get into this one later, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. So meta stories of origin is the multi-technique strategy that Kristen and I came up with. And really what the origin of this strategy is to actually pull from a lot of different methodologies to do the initial research, to better understand and to better grasp the information needed to develop and design these particular platforms that are not only just historically informed, but also that is community centered, you know? And so a lot of these techniques are pretty common in information science, things like document analysis, data collection, different data collection methods, community, like oral history, not necessarily common in information science, but it is a methodology that is known in the academy as being sufficient in things like anthropology or more historical fields. in Black studies particularly. And so this particular technique focuses on how do we understand these methodologies in relationship to climatic disasters and the legacy of colonialism, which we see done in a series of different works by a series of different scholars, which we can discuss more in our conversation today. But yes, the meta stories of origin is a work in progress technique, but it is supposed to be a type of encompassing all like engaging technique that helps us better think about the ways in which Black communities around the world are engaging with climatic disasters through the legacy of colonialism by using these different histories to understand these different methods to understand these particular histories. So the next slide is understanding alternative knowledge structures, which is where I'll get into the one where I said I'll come back to later. So some of the questions that we ask here is like information that doesn't move but stays still. Like what exactly is that? How does information travel in areas that are rural? How does information travel in non-digital spaces? What are ways that information gets consumed and shared across Black communities? So the first one is around stillness. One of the things that we understand and that we have researched and have kind of come to the conclusion is that Black populations around the world aren't always like it's not always about physical movement to a new space that is global. Oftentimes, this migration conversation has to do around one, the political conversations around the social formation of borders themselves, and what does it mean to immigrate, migrate, move from one place to another nationally. But one of the things that we had discovered is that there are a lot of Black populations around the world who don't have the access or the resources to move. And so what happens in particular places where communities or people or populations are stuck, what happens to the information in these particular locations? Do information around climate change, do information around disasters move, or do they stay still, or how do they move? And so if they don't move, why is that happening? And if they do move, how can we understand that movement? And one of the things that we came up with, which is the latter, which is how can we understand that movement? We have to understand how information moves across time. How does information evolve versus how information actually physically moves? Movement across time versus movement through space is one of the things that we were trying to comprehend and conceptualize at the time of exploring that particular question. The second one is information travel in rural areas. Now, we understand that information migration in rural areas work different than in urban centers. And the reason why that is because rural areas are oftentimes more sparse with less transportation, less resources, less things, right? Less access to cellular devices or internet, less access to those different things. So how do Black communities in rural areas actually engage with information migration? Or the migration of information in this particular time, or how do they engage with information around climatic disasters in general, is one of the things that are understudied and we want to explore more of. The third one is how does information travel in non-digital spaces? This goes back to the first two. How do information particularly travel in spaces that aren't constantly moving? In digital spaces, this is like an infinite movement, right? Things move across digital spaces all the time so quickly, you know? And so what does it mean to be in spaces that one, don't have access to digital technology, and two, what does it mean to not be on the internet? So there's one. The fourth one is what are ways that information gets consumed and shared across Black communities? That's kind of been explained through this. So some of the things that we were coming up with through our research is radio, sound versus reading, or sound versus maybe something like a journal article or something like a newspaper, you know, griot, postering, music, door-to-door communication, maroonage, dance, spirituality, oral history. These are all complex. things. And while I said oral history earlier was a type of methodology kind of conformed to the academy, it also operates as a traditional oral history or traditional methodology in communities that have a separate meaning in terms of stories and histories that get passed down through oration versus the written language. So we can talk about dance and spirituality and maroonage and different things like postering and music and radio and how these different things access information or like kind of affect Black communities and Black communities engagement with information around climactic disasters and different things. So there's that. So yes, we will go to the last slide, which the next slide, Sarah. And thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation. We can get into things. Thank you so much.
Yay, so good.
Thank you. I was mumbling so much. But 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞, do you want to guide us into this next part?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞. I have so many questions for us. And so I'm going to pose 2 threads and y'all can choose which one y'all want to go. So in listening to our presentations, I can't help but note that we talk a lot about place, and sometimes we talk about place as like as a home, I would say like a place of origins also, and then we also think about like our geographical places that we either embed our subjects in, our research in, or just that movement between places and like the impact different places have on our research. So that's thread 1. But then the other thread that I can't help but think about too is movement. And I love having this conversation, I think, with Sarah, and I think 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞, we've had this conversation too. And so even thinking about, how do we think about movement of information in its most physical, its most simplest form of like going from point A to point B, but then also that temporal movement of going from point A, say in 2022, to point B, which might be 2032 or even hundreds or thousands of years in the future. So those 2 threads I think would be so interesting to discuss, but I'm also open to anything else that might have popped up for you all as we were each talking.
I have a bias towards the second.
Yeah, let's do movement. We love that one.
Yeah. So many thoughts. 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞, you can go first, or 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐿, you kind of brought it in.
Yeah, so if you'll see on the screen, these are kind of like just general questions that we thought would be interesting for each of us to talk about, but then this is also just going to be a general conversation. And so for me, physical movements are the beginning of my questions, right? Where it's like, what do you do when a child or adolescent in foster care, not even when they're in foster care and displaced because of a disaster, but even before then, right? Like that movement from their place of origin, their biological home, to a place of temporality, or even just suspension of a place. But then that eventually leads me to thoughts around their future selves, right? Because I think a lot about that earlier stage in a human's person, and then thinking about that they're just going to hopefully continue going through that stage to a temporal place. I haven't gone beyond the time of one person, but I do think that y'all speak a little bit better to that across generations, right?
I'll just chime in real quick about this. 𝐓𝐢𝐭𝐥𝐞, based on your research with like children experiencing these crises and creating their form of memory, and then an external party creating that form of memory, and then the children moving away from that home or that place, really resonated with what I've been trying to figure out of like, to not expand my research and then just scope it, but I still think it's very interesting. So in my context, during the Vietnam War, Korean War, there's a lot, and like within a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, a lot of US Imperial Army men were given these spaces that were called were for like rest and recreation during the wars, which led to comfort women as a sort of trafficking and commerce in those countries. So a lot of Vietnamese women, Korean women had relations with these American men and eventually birthed a son or a daughter. And those children were known as Amer-Asians. And so they had this sort of like living in this, being born out of this woman who didn't really want this child either because they were doing it out of their job. And then the US had this like reparations time where they did like, it was, they brought over these Amer-Asians because they had American blood, right? Or they had their father's eyes or something. So it kind of like really dignified this idea that they are white, so therefore they get to have this privilege of moving. But then the mother had to stay behind. So they were separated from their mother. And then it goes into like this idea of like, of just thinking about how a lot of these Amer-Asian, especially men, are actually in LA, Seattle, in particular, and a lot of them are in these statistics to be experiencing homelessness as well. And so I think it's very interesting to see within your research of like, how do these children turning into this older person to be, what are they experiencing and like, how have they been able to work through it? And, you know, when they come over to the US, they weren't able to get adopted because their dad had PTSD from the war. So it's like, there's so much like social and political context and like how these types of like memory making isn't able to actually happen because they're just, you know, still living in this like unstable place. So there is no place as home anymore and there is no origins, but they're constantly in movement, right? Yeah, that's what resonated with me with that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love the way you contextualize the complex. It's so nuanced, you know, and I think that like the thing it's reminding me of the conversation is that oftentimes I think that when we talk about movement, when we talk about migration, when we talk about the ways information gets moved from one place to another, either through a place, which is usually catalyzed through a body, through a person, a subject, a population, or through some media or some understanding of a particular population. You know, there's so many different things. I think, Sarah, you have brought up, I think like Chinese populations in COVID-19 in your presentation, and like the ways in which that conversation kind of warped in the past 3-4 years, like kind of warped this like media understanding of what it was, what's going on, how Vietnamese populations reacted to that, what's happening. And I think in relationship to Black communities in places like, let's say, the United States versus like a place like Haiti, is that like like migration is quite physical in both. It's very physical in both. But it's also very still, you know, at the same time. And I'll come back to that concept a little later, but both to me, like really has an origin in violence, really has an origins in displacement, really has an origin in a lot of different things. One of the big things about the migration of Black people throughout the United States happens around enslavement at the abolition of slavery and right? So it's like people in the United States are literally exiting an entire institution of slavery in the American South and now having to go into a quote unquote workforce that has completely like isolated them, right? Like they don't have the skill, they don't have all these other things, like which is where convict leasing ended up coming in, right? Because education was limited to a very specific few Black folks, and that usually was very, very rare. And it was, and there's tons of different histories to contextualize it. One of them being the child of a slave master and having them send you off to places like Harvard or Yale or Oxford or, you know, someplace. But most formerly enslaved Black people at the turn of the century didn't have massive houses. My God, someone's calling me. Jesus Christ. Sorry, can y'all still hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, so basically there was so many things. I'm like all over the place, but in places like the United States, it literally starts at one place. It goes through these different systems and structures and these political structures, one being convict leasing, one being sharecropping, the other one being the entire civil rights era. You have the rise of the prison industrial complex, the medical industrial complex. You have the school to prison pipeline being formed and education being warped into all these things. You have these things continuing across time. And so through this, there's a physical migration from the South to the Midwest to the West Coast, and then up north, from the South to North, Midwest, and then West Coast. And there's this literal physical migration of populations of people. But the information in but one of the things is that a lot of Black people ended up staying behind. The South still has the largest Black population in the entire country, and there was lots of people who could not physically move, and they ended up staying in the places where their ancestors were enslaved. The same housing, the same shacks, the same, all that. And so when we get to places like Haiti, more recently, there was a hurricane. I forget the exact name of the hurricane that people named it, but there was a hurricane that ended up happening recently, and they tried to come into the United States, and the United States denied them and sent them all back. They were trying to file for a refugee status in the US. One of the things about this is that what happens when you desire movement, but are refused it, and are forced into a state in which you are constantly having to experience the political instability that was originally caused underneath European colonial practices at the during the Haitian Revolution. This goes back so many centuries, and understanding why is it that Haiti in particular senses lack the infrastructures to sustain particular life during these massive disasters, right? One of them is climatically charged, is that disasters are becoming more and more intense as the year goes on, right? And then the other one is political. There has been a history, starting with France, of literally isolating Haiti from the world by literally depriving them of resources so that they can then end up starving, being really under-resourced, a really under-resourced country. And so what happens when you have an entire population that comes from this very hyper-political place, which all places are hyper-political, but has this very particular history of literal national divestment from its country, or international divestment from its country? What happens to that? And so it differs in places like Veracruz, for example, in Mexico, where music, if we take that as an information structure, travels from the African continent into the Caribbean, into Veracruz, and the ways in which these particular musics that was created by enslaved African people will be used for freedom fighting and more liberatory practices later on down the road and through time, which will create maroonage systems in Mexico, across Mexico itself. And so how do you map histories that do move, like the idea or the concept or the essence of it move, but the population, and with the populations, there is a migration. But when you actually look at the contemporary world and how it stays still, if you look at the enslavement of African people from the African continent as being one particular history that is from imperialism, colonization, and then you move into enslavement, if we understand those as two different things, that influence one another, but two separate histories and two separate, complex and nuanced histories that link together. One literally starts when one ends. And so when one starts, one maintains itself still, And so anyways, that's, I don't know how to explain.
We're gonna have to do a panel number 2, because I'm just like suspended movement, denied movement, deprived movement. But I think we're at time. Does anyone have any closing thoughts? Sarah, did you want to respond? I'm good. I appreciate y'all always so much. An hour is never enough with you two. But yeah, do you want to say anything, Sarah, or should we just
I think we can close it out. Yeah, just I know you all are tuning in later on, so go ahead and rewind and email us, tweet at us. We're here to talk about all this because we're going to be thinking about it. We want to talk about it more.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
yeah, thank
Barely
you so much.
started. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It was awesome.
So
Thank you.
much.
Okay.